Hello, Nadje Al-Ali. We are very happy to have this interview with you among the Asfari online archives about activism in the Arab region. Can you introduce yourself, please? We know that your bio is very long, but 2 words for the non-informed people.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having this interview with me. So I'm Nadje Al-Ali. I'm a professor of gender studies at SOAS, University of London, where I'm chairing the Center for Gender Studies, and I'm also the head of the doctoral school. But I'm also a feminist activist and involved in various organizations linked to women's rights in Iraq and wider in the region, as well as in the UK.
How would you assess the feminist landscape in the Arab region in 2017 and now that we are in January 2018?
I mean, it's quite diverse. I think that given that women and men in the region have been faced with a range of different crises, the resurgence of political authoritarianism, economic crisis. I mean, one of the side effects, I think, has been that I think that a new generation of feminists has come into being, and of course, it's very important to differentiate. I mean, I've worked a long time on Iraq, for example, and the situation in Iraq and the situation for feminists in Iraq is very different than for feminists in Egypt, for example. I mean, in Iraq, as yesterday I was giving a talk at AUB, and I started it out by speaking about the kinds of struggles that Iraqi women are facing. That is a draft law that was presented in parliament that would make not just polygamy, but child marriage and marital rape legal. You have a woman MP in the Iraqi parliament who asked for polygamy, to promote polygamy and to give men who marry another woman money to do so. So that's a very different kind of context that, maybe women in Tunisia or Egypt or Lebanon are facing. I mean, not to say that they're not facing, less severe struggles, but they're on a different scale. So I would always make a plea for differentiation in a context where there are so many different challenges for women. One of the reasons of hope is that you do have this new generation of feminists, and I feel that they are, very courageous, and they're tackling issues that have been taboo issues for the previous generation. So, for instance, when I did my PhD on the feminist movement in Egypt in the 90s, I do remember when Markaz Dirasat al-Mara al-Jadida for the first time actually issued a report on gender-based violence, and everyone was shouting, including other feminists, this is not an issue that we are facing in our country. This is something that we are facing in the West. But we have moved a long way from that. It is of course very sad that women are facing so many forms of gender-based violence, but they're not a taboo issue anymore. We can speak about sexual harassment. We can speak about domestic violence now, and it is, and even feminists are starting to tackle, very sensitive issues around reproductive rights, around sexuality, and so on, while also tackling all the issues that have always been on the agenda, linked to legal rights, to citizenship, access to resources, and so on. I mean, I just want to say one thing. I mean, I also mentioned that in my talk. As someone who, after Egypt, I worked on Iraq for quite a while. I mean, being half Iraqi, I'm quite invested in what's happening there. And one of the things that I learned there was to really be more inclusive when we think about feminism in the region. I mean, in Iraq, you have a very large Kurdish population, you have Assyrians, you have Turkmen, you have Chaldeans, Shabak, so many different ethnic minorities. And it doesn't work to speak about Arab feminism in that context. And I would personally extend it, actually, because even if you speak, at the conference on feminism in the region at AUB, there was a Nubian feminist to speak about, being a Nubian feminist in Egypt and what does that mean. In Morocco we have Berbers. I mean, across the region we have ethnic minorities. So I personally would like us to move away from the designation of Arab feminism. I mean, you can say feminism in Arab majority countries or something along those lines. If we don't like Middle East region, maybe use West Asia. But I would personally move away from the Arab feminism denomination.
Along with this distinction, and we are very happy that you brought this, to what extent do you see globalized feminists, young feminists, as a threat or as an enrichment to the diversity of the feminist movements in the region?
Yeah.
I mean that not only sexual harassment, but sexual harassment campaign or Me Too campaign, or the alliance between a lot of women rights activists and the LGBT movements, be it in Lebanon, in Palestine, or in Egypt, Indonesia as well, and pushing this versus another version of reproductive health and alliance with state feminism and CEDAW. How do you see this kind of...
Yeah, there's a lot in there what you're saying, and I think there are lots of different things. So I personally would make a strong distinction between the kind of international gender machinery linked to, UN institutions and the kinds of institutionalized gender mainstreaming, the whole industry, which is definitely exists, and it's kind of exists on a global scale. And while I would hesitate to say that, we need it, although it has lots of limitations and problems, and sometimes it's doing more harm than good, and sometimes it's also problematic. So for instance, something like UN Resolution 1325 that states that women should be involved in peace transitions and post-conflict transition. In a context like Iraq, how could one push really for 1325, where the UN played a devastating role for 13 years in actually organizing the sanctions regime that killed so many people? It's very difficult then to use the same mechanism to say, gender equality. There's a problem there. I also think there's a problem there in that much of this globalized gender machinery is about ticking the box. Inclusion means a certain number of women sitting around the table. We know that that is not enough. That could often be tokenistic. But at the same time, of course, we do need women to sit around the table. Of course, we do need women to participate. But there's something else happening globally. There is a kind of transnational feminist movement that is more grassroots, and that's very critical of this institutionalized feminism. And wherever you are in the world, whether you're in the United States or you're in Lebanon or in Iraq or Egypt, there are feminists who are part of this critical transnational feminist lens. I think what connects them is not only that they might be involved in campaigns and advocacy transnationally, outside of bounded geographical context, but that their politics is transnational. And what I mean by that is a transnational feminist politics, which is, this idea that has been developed by many feminists, amongst them, for instance, Chandra Mohanty, is that feminism needs to be intersectional. So, we cannot just focus on gender-based inequality linked to patriarchy, but we have to analyze any given historical and empirical context and see what other power configurations are working on women's and men's lives. So, for instance, class-based differences, differences based on ethnicity and race, religion, sexuality. For instance, in the Iraqi context, I would not have been able to understand gender norms and relations and gender-based inequalities. Yes, I had to look at the specific forms of patriarchy in Iraq, but I had to look at sectarianism. I have to look at political authoritarianism. I have to look at imperialism. I have to look at neoliberalism and see how these different power configurations intersect to then work on men's and women's lives. So I think it is a positive thing that we have increasingly generations of feminists who are involved in developing this transnational feminist thought. And although it is of course true that when it comes to access to resources, there is an imbalance that often those based in Western institutions in northern countries would have more access to resources. But I personally think that we really cannot speak of Western feminism as opposed to a non-Western feminism anymore, because when you see the development of feminist thought in the academia, but also in activism, it is very much shaped by people who have come from somewhere else or have been involved in struggles all around the world. So I think it's much more fluid and much more interactive, and the struggles of activists in this region have also shaped the way that feminist thought has developed in institutions in North America or Europe. I mean, there's a connective there. Of course, there is though an issue that you have then this kind of, although it's sort of grassroots and it's critical, but it's often people who, through their education, through language, whether they speak English or French or another globalized language, might have more access to these transnational networks. So there will, in any context, like in Lebanon, there are some feminists who travel to these different places in the region, but also elsewhere in the world, whether it's in Asia, Africa, Latin America, or Western context, and then some who don't. And often, there is a class issue there. There's an issue around education, language, and there is, I still think, often a disconnect. And we know that there is an issue in terms of those initiatives that are kind of urban-based, middle-class feminist initiatives, and then what's happening in terms of either working-class migrant neighborhoods or in the countryside. So I don't really want to say that there is not some tension between a kind of globalized feminism, but I also would say that it's happening on different levels, and global for me doesn't just mean influenced by the West. I mean, it's much more of a dialectic, and I think it is a good thing that we have. I mean, first of all, I think it's a good thing that there are initiatives to tackle harassment in the region, but also it's a good thing to recognize, of course, it's not exceptional to the region, sexual harassment. I mean, that's one of the things that I've been here for many years when, people are kind of trying to make this difference between, the West and the East, or the Arab world, the Middle East and the West, is that we cannot say that women have it all in North America and Europe. Far from it, whether it is with respect to harassment, whether it is in relation to the division of labor, whether it is in terms of childcare or caring responsibilities, or I mean, I am one of, I think there's 8% of female professors in the UK. I mean, 8% of professors are female. It's ridiculous, and gender pay gaps in all, institutions at universities. So it's something that is it is a global problem.
And to what extent, in the same vein, to what extent do you agree about rising dichotomy within the region, in the Lebanese, Egyptian, Palestinian context, and Iraqi, of course, who are treating this social divide that you have very well described in terms of black feminism versus white feminism, because it's very frequent now to talk about the globalized activists as expression of the white feminism versus the black feminism who would be carried by non-educated or less educated activists, less urban activists, and less exposed to the global agenda.
I don't recognize that, and I think it's a misrepresentation because, you know, black feminist thought also got institutionalized, and you have, I mean, when you think about women and gender studies departments in the United States, I mean, it is, black feminist thought is part of the curriculum, is part of the establishment. When I think about, you know, some of the white students in my class who are taking gender studies courses, some of them are first generation, you know, working class background, first generation in university, have to work 2 jobs in order to survive while being in university, while some of the students from, you know, either this region or from African countries or from Asia come from upper middle class elite families where, you know, they don't have to worry. Of course, we also have lots of students, you know, who are there on scholarships and are struggling. But I think this sort of division, black versus white, is not very helpful and does not really reflect, in my view, the way that feminist thought has developed. So there is something called transnational feminist you know, thought and politics, or, you know, post-colonial feminism that is actually very much, I mean, the whole idea was to look beyond the identity politics that was very much part of the 90s, and of course is re-emerging now again. I understand why it is re-emerging. I mean, if you have someone like Trump, if you have something like Brexit, if you have racism, if you have Islamophobia, of course identity politics comes to the fore. But while it is important to recognize our differences, and while I think it is important for white people to recognize whiteness as an ethnicity and as a privilege, you know, white people can be and should be anti-racist and involved in intersectional feminist struggle. And much of the post-colonial and transnational feminist thought has grown out of the merging together of Marxist thought, you know, post-colonial feminist thought, black feminist thought, post-structuralism as well, and queer feminism, and is bringing this all together and saying, you know, yes, we might have different positionalities and different trajectories, but we can actually arrive at similar politics and similar values and join the struggle. And this struggle has to be an intersectional struggle, right? And because we're differently positioned, and also because we have different locations, whether it is the academia or activism or, you know, being in North America or Europe or, you know, the Arab world, the Middle East, Africa, that obviously will influence the kinds of emphasis and the kinds of struggles that we will privilege at any given time. But it's not set in stone, and it cannot be reduced to the color of our skin, although of course I also realize that, for instance, I mean, in the British context, black feminism means something very different than in the US context. I mean, in the British context, black feminism refers to an umbrella of feminist thought by African, Caribbean, South Asian, Muslim women, you know, who have come together, who came together at a certain time to challenge the then predominantly white, heterosexual, middle-class feminism. But while that is still, of course, an important category, but, you know, it is not the main. I mean, this white feminism has moved on. It's not what it was in the 70s or the 80s. It is intersectional. So I personally don't think it's very useful, this division. I mean, this was a long answer, but yeah.
Thank you. Kind of following on from Dina's question concerning this division, one thing I've always been very interested in is this concept of affinities, the ways in which to kind of forge affinities with different feminist collectives, different feminist perspectives and thought. And in a way, I want to return back to your first kind of response, which is saying, you know, rather than having Arab feminism, is to have Southwest Asian feminism, for example. So I just wonder, as you said also, we're in a moment now where identity politics has come back to the fore. I mean, it's from the 90s to now, and there's a reason for that. We're having new forms of patriarchy emerging vis-a-vis, you know, Monsieur Trump, for example. So I wonder, in this day and age, what kinds of affinities do you see, or collaborations, but I prefer that word affinity, if you like, between different kind of feminist collectives and...
Yeah, so one... I think, and this also goes back to an earlier question, I think one important shift and new form of affinity is that between feminists and then queer activists. And I'm saying queer activists as opposed to LGBT activists because, so I am actually just right now in the process of co-authoring a chapter with Beirut-based activist and feminist Riwa Sayek, who's editor of Kohol magazine. And you know, we're looking at the way how sort of historically, I mean, when I was in Egypt and doing research on feminist activists in the 90s, no one would touch anything to do with gay rights. I mean, you don't go there because already feminists were under close scrutiny and were being discredited for being too close to the West. So if they would have, even those who might have been sympathetic, if they would have touched anything linked to gay rights, it would have totally been the end of their credibility. At the same time, you have the emergence now over the last decade of LGBT activism in the region. And I think one of the, you know, I think quite sort of productive sort of collaborations or affinity is between, you know, those feminists who really think intersectionally and also think, well, we need to address certain taboo issues, even linked to heteronormativity, I mean, sexuality more broadly, and the emergence of what I would call queer feminist spaces. So these queer feminist spaces are uncomfortable with not only the monopoly of gay men in these LGBT movements, because they're often very much dominated by gay men, but they're also uncomfortable with the identity politics and the links to the Gay International. I mean, I personally have lots of issues with Joseph Massad's article, but of course there is something in the problematic of the Gay International. And so queer feminists have kind of reacted to that, but at the same time they've also reacted to all the generations of feminists who were either totally blind to sexuality, some might even have been homophobic, and others just for political strategic reasons didn't go there. So this is sort of coming together, and I think that's a really, really very powerful affinity in coming together. And I know that here in Beirut, but also in Cairo, is the affinity between feminist mobilization and migrant labor organization. I think that's really important, and of course most of the migrant labor, especially domestic labor, are women, and so that has brought about, I think, a very important affinity and a kind of joint struggle and a joint mobilization. Now I think, again, we have to look specifically at different contexts. So in the Iraqi context, there has been a strong affinity between feminists and anti-sectarian and anti-corruption struggles. And I don't know that much about Lebanon, but from what I know, I think there are also similar tendencies here, that in terms of the anti-corruption, anti-sectarian, that feminists have actually played an important role in that. Certainly in the Iraqi context, they have been at the forefront. And I think that what is also happening, and I guess for me another source of hope, which is, yes, there are new forms of patriarchy emerging, that's right. But as I said yesterday in my talk, I don't think there's any more patriarchal consensus. So I think there are more and more men, especially young men, who actually recognize that their struggle against authoritarian regimes, their struggle against militarism, against Islamism, against sectarianism, even against corruption, that gender-based justice and gender-based equality is not a side issue, but that it actually is at the center of that wider issue, which is really new. Because in the past, we've always been told, well, let's liberate society first, let's liberate the working classes, let's liberate the nation from the occupier, and then you will automatically get your rights. And of course, we never automatically got our rights. And yes, I mean, initially in Egypt, women didn't particularly think it was a feminist issue. I know that many of my friends said, why would anyone make something out of it as, how do you feel as a woman? We were there together, but very early on it emerged that, there are women's issues, there are specific feminist concerns here. So I think the affinity with men, especially, men who recognize that patriarchy is not good for them either. I think that's a very important development.
Thank you. I'll ask one more question. So the final question is kind of more for the kind of our young researchers coming out of the region and hopefully this. And it's just if you have any advice, suggestions for them as to how to go about being a feminist, whether they're male or female or whatever, and if they want to kind of do these kinds of research and the challenges that they will inevitably face in the region while trying to do that, if you have any advice for them.
Yeah, well, for me it's a dialectic process in terms of the topic you choose and your kind of feminist conceptualizations. So what does it mean to be a feminist researcher? For me, it means that you recognize, so there are different ways of being a feminist, but the very basic definition for me would be you recognize that there are structural inequalities in society, whatever society, and that these are not random, but they're systematic, and that these are based on gender inequalities. That's the first thing, the kind of recognition that there's something structurally happening. It's not just an individual woman or an individual man. And secondly, very importantly, what is for me contained in the term feminist is the attempt to change it, to transform this and try to contribute to address these inequalities, with the goal of having a more egalitarian and just society. So if that is, in the back of your mind, that would influence your choice of topic. You don't have to study women to be a feminist researcher. I think that's very important, and I think for a long time that's what we did, and there's a reason, because for a long time women were marginalized in the writing of histories that are written out in terms of, political economies and so on. But no, you can study any phenomenon, any forms of social change, institutions, political development, the economy, through a feminist lens. Of course, there are lots of different approaches. There is, historically, I think we have been better in terms of qualitative research, and I think that's more, seems to be more conducive to our kind of feminist ideas about, establishing, the involving, whether it's men or women, the people who we're studying, involving them in our research. We're interested in meaning. You're not just interested in generating numbers and statistics. And I think that's really important. But I think it would be really good if we have more trained feminist researchers in quantitative methods who are not falling into this institutional report writing, writing reports for the UN or so, who have a critical feminist lens, but know how to deal with numbers and are able to challenge some of the official reports, you know. So I think that would be really important. I think it's very important to read a lot and not try to reinvent the wheel, because you know, we've covered lots of things. It doesn't mean, I mean, there's you know, lots more to do, but I think it's important, you know, before anyone starts to do research, or you know, when you have an idea of what you want to do, to really try to do your homework and find out what has been written, and not only what has been written, let's say, in relation to this phenomenon in Beirut, but look outside, you know, maybe in Cairo or in Baghdad, or actually outside the region somewhere else. You know, how would that help me to actually shape my ideas and my concepts? And then there's this, of course, this dialectic between our conceptual framework, the theories we use, and then those of us, not everyone does empirical work. I mean, I'm an anthropologist, so my work is always empirically grounded. And those, you know, empirical findings then shape and influence, in turn, our concepts as well. I think people who are young researchers who are based in the region, many of them have the advantage of speaking several languages, and I very much encourage them to read in all languages. I mean, to be more clear, to read Arabic sources alongside English sources, and if they speak French, French sources, because it is very clear that, of course, different. So I mean, certainly there's a big difference between sort of Anglo-Saxon and Francophone scholarship. And I think if you have access to both and also have access to Arabic sources, that's a real privilege. And I think that is an advantage over many scholars based in Western institutions who only have access to one language. Yeah, and I guess I would, for young feminist researchers, I mean, I would take this opportunity to make a plug for COHOL, the Journal of Body and Gender Research. So I'm on the advisory board, and one idea of the journal is to actually encourage young feminist researchers and activists who are based in the region, actually anywhere, but you know, we have given sort of particular emphasis to researchers and activists in the region, who might not have an institutional affiliation, who might not be experienced in publishing, and the idea is really to not just have a peer review process where we say, oh, you know, this is not good enough, but you know, if there's an idea, you know, we really try to make it happen. You know, we put lots of effort in supporting authors to actually get published at the end. So then I would say, yeah, try to submit something to COHOL.
We will, and thank you so much, Nadje, for your time and for enriching our online archives with your testimonial. And please come back to AUB.
Thank you very much.
Contact.
Thank you.
Thank you.